Hello and welcome to my first lecture on marijuana. This is going to be an interesting one. Marijuana is a fascinating drug. Its history, its use, what we know about its effects on the body, on the brain, lots of cool stuff to talk about. So without further ado, let's just get started with kind of an interesting, I think, observation. And that is that marijuana is kind of a difficult drug to classify. It's difficult because it has some stimulant effects. When users use it, they often experience a little bit of increased energy, especially early on in the use of the drug. But this effect is not nearly so strong as we see with the main stimulant drugs like amphetamines and cocaine. It also has some sedating effects. It makes people feel mellow and relaxed, but these are not nearly so strong as the effects that we associate with sedatives or with opiate narcotics. And as compared to those two classes of drugs, there's really no risk for coma or death associated with the sedating effects of marijuana. It's a drug which has some analgesic effects, meaning it's useful for managing pain, but it's not nearly so strong as the pain management that you get from opiates, nor are the molecules in marijuana chemically similar to those we find in the opiate drugs. It has some hallucinogenic effects, especially in so much as when people are on marijuana, they experience distortions in their perception of time, and to some extent some distortions in their perception of auditory information. But these distortions are not nearly so strong as we would see for the drugs which we group together as hallucinogens, such as LSD, for instance. So in some respects, marijuana is a drug which is like other drugs, at least a little bit, but it's also very much like itself, or unique unto itself. Now, marijuana is a controversial drug, of course, and you don't need me to tell you that. The legalization, or more frankly, the legal status of the drug is a complicated issue, and we find that proponents of marijuana legalization often emphasize the benefits associated with this drug, and also the risks associated with other drugs, particularly alcohol. Opponents of marijuana legalization often emphasize the risks associated with this drug. So we get kind of a very mixed picture about it. How dangerous is marijuana? How dangerous is it relative to other drugs we can talk about? It makes marijuana a complicated and fascinating drug to talk about. So with those kind of preliminary ideas in mind, let's move on. I'll give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm just going to introduce the marijuana plant, talk a little bit about our study of it, how we reckon its potency, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of marijuana. So first off, introducing marijuana. As we've seen with so many other drugs that we've covered in this class, the story of marijuana begins with a plant, and that plant is the hemp plant or cannabis plant, which grows pretty much worldwide. If you're south of the Arctic zone and north of the Antarctic zone, you can probably find marijuana. It is a plant which produces very strong fibers in its stems, which is one of the reasons it's been cultivated for a very long period of time to produce fabric and rope. It also has cannabinoids, which are an interesting class of chemicals which are present mostly in the resin of the plant, mostly in the leaves or flowering portions of the plant. And throughout history, mankind has found a lot of different uses for this plant. As I mentioned before, it can be useful for producing ropes and fabrics. Marijuana's psychoactive compounds have been used medicinally. They've been used and continue to be used for religious purposes. And of course, it's very popular as a recreational drug. Now, there are a lot of different types of cannabis plants, and there are a lot of different strains of marijuana that you could purchase if you're trying to buy marijuana to use for really any reason. But most of them trace back to two primary species of the plant. That is the Cannabis sativa and the Cannabis indica plant. And many of, if you were in a state where marijuana has been legalized, for instance in Colorado, and you were purchasing marijuana to use recreationally, for instance, you could buy among a very large diversity of different strains of marijuana. Most of these are created by crossing and hybridizing sativa and indica plants so as to manipulate the levels of different cannabinoids present in the plant. And as I said before, those cannabinoids are a large group of different molecules present in the plant, mostly in the resin found in the flowering portion of the plant. We're going to focus on just two of those cannabinoids, the first of which is delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or delta 9 THC, or just THC. This is the psychoactive cannabinoid in marijuana, which we think is kind of associated with the feeling of being high. Now, if you've ever used marijuana, you probably know immediately what that feeling is. If you haven't used marijuana, it's the part of the experience that is could be described as feeling sort of happy. The world seems kind of a little bit more interesting. You feel giggly. The stereotype of the marijuana user as being kind of cheerfully amused by things and kind of goofy maybe maps on a little bit to that sense of the high of using marijuana, and that feeling seems to be associated with THC. And it's interesting to note that there are relatively high concentrations of THC in the Cannabis sativa plant as compared to the Cannabis indica plant. Another cannabinoid to talk about is cannabidiol, which is the psychoactive cannabinoid in marijuana associated with the stoned feeling. And again, if you've ever used marijuana, you probably know what this feeling is. If you haven't, this is the feeling of being kind of withdrawn from the world, a little bit sort of distant and spacey, sitting down on the couch and kind of staring off into the distance, feeling perhaps a bit tired or a bit kind of sleepy and relaxed. And for some people, this is a nice feeling. For other people, it isn't. Perhaps the stereotype of the marijuana user is the stoner who just kind of spaces out and sits on the couch for hours at a time. That's somewhat maps onto that feeling of being stoned, and it seems to be associated with cannabidiol, which is interestingly enough found in higher concentrations in the Cannabis indica plant than in the Cannabis sativa plant. So, depending on the type of access you had to marijuana, you might be able to purchase a pure strain of sativa or a pure strain of indica, depending on which of these two feelings you tended to prefer, or if you were purchasing marijuana from a high-end boutique shop in an area where marijuana was legalized, you could probably purchase hybridized plants, which are made by crossing sativa and indica, much as we might cross an apple plants or corn plants to achieve different types of offspring generation. You can find strains of marijuana which are grown to emphasize the high feeling, or emphasize the stoned feeling, or emphasize other feelings associated with other cannabinoids, which for the purposes of saving time I'm not even going to mention right now. Suffice it to say that the kind of agriculture and the botany behind growing marijuana, despite the fact that it's an illegal drug, at least from a federal perspective, is quite sophisticated. And I can remember back in graduate school hanging out with some friends of mine who were and are pretty high-tech neuroscientists, but were also fairly avid marijuana users, and they were regaling me at great length about all the different types of marijuana you could get and all the different relative levels of cannabinoids. And it actually reminded me of years prior working at a wine store where I, before I went to grad school, and getting very educated about the different types of wine that you can purchase around the world based on different grapes grown in different ways and that have different flavor profiles. In an analogous sense, there's a similar level of sophistication that grows into growing a lot of marijuana, at least a lot of the high-end stuff. That kind of brings us into talking a little bit about how potent the marijuana is, how strong a drug it is. And because it's a drug that comes from a plant source, it can vary quite a bit in its potency, kind of like we saw with the varying levels of potency for different psilocybin mushrooms, some being relatively strong because there's a lot of psilocybin in them, some being relatively weak. Analogously, in different types of marijuana, they're grown and processed in different ways. We see different levels of cannabinoids, especially different levels of THC, which is the one we often focus on a lot. So just to be clear, when we're talking about marijuana, we're really talking about the kind of the flowering and leafing part of the cannabis plant. So not so much the stems and kind of the bigger leaves, but the kind of the small flowering leaves. That's the marijuana. And the reason we're focusing on this is where most of the resin in the plant is, and most of the cannabinoids are found in the resin. Interestingly, the resin is grown by the female version of the plant. marijuana is a plant, or I should say cannabis is a plant that's, what's the term? It's diocerous, I believe. It's essentially a plant which is not hermaphroditic. It grows either female or male. Many plants have both sex organs and are able to pollinate and be pollinated. Marijuana isn't. It's either a female plant or a male plant, and the female plant develops this resin which can catch pollen which drifts through the air from the male plant and allow the plant to be fertilized. That resin contains a lot of the cannabinoids, like I've already said, that have the interesting psychoactive effects on humans. So anyway, marijuana is the drug portion of the plant, to be simplistic about it. And there are different grades of marijuana that have different potencies because of different levels of cannabinoids. At the very low end, there's a type of marijuana which is commonly called ditchweed, and that actually is a somewhat technical term you can find both in common use and also in some scientific writing. Ditchweed is essentially marijuana that is growing wild in the environment, perhaps in a ditch, though not necessarily. Ditchweed grows all over the place. I'm sure I wouldn't have to travel too far from my office here in North Dakota to find a field where there's some marijuana just growing. But if I was so inclined, and I'm not, but if I was so inclined to dry out and smoke the marijuana I found, or the cannabis I found, I probably wouldn't get very high from it because the level of THC in wild growing marijuana tends to be fairly low. And it's fairly low because once a female plant has been pollinated by a male plant, it stops producing resin and thus has much lower levels of the cannabinoids in it than we would find in other types of marijuana. So I'm sure if you smoked enough of it, you could probably get a little bit high, but probably not very much so. That would be kind of low level, mostly wild growing cannabis in the environment. If we step up from that a little bit, we have regular marijuana, which is, again, a kind of a semi-technical term. You'll hear people refer to regular marijuana or regs marijuana. That's what people used to say in Florida, at least when I used to live there. That's marijuana that's been cultivated, or I should say cannabis that has been cultivated to produce marijuana for use. Here, there is some pollination that's occurred between the male and female plants, but the grower tries to limit the amount of pollination by removing as best he or she can the male plants from the environment. So it's mostly or entirely female plants growing in an area. That's actually very hard to do because you have to know a lot about the plants to judge which is the male and which is the female. And the pollen from male plants is very small and can drift a very long distance. But let's say you were growing some cannabis and you wanted to have higher levels of resin. You could try and get rid of the male plants so that the female plants, unfertilized, would just continue to produce resin. And depending on how successful you were, you could have levels of THC of upwards to 6 or even maybe 10% of the weight of the plant would be THC. Or I should say the percentage of THC found in the plant would be 6 to 10% by weight. Now, that's quite a lot, and that's probably enough to produce a lot of the high or stoned feelings that people like for marijuana. It's interesting to note that the level of THC in kind of regular grown marijuana has changed over the years and was in the 1970s or so relatively low, probably just barely enough to get you high. These days, regular marijuana is quite a bit stronger than it used to be. Let's say you wanted to make an even stronger drug product. You could try to grow your cannabis plants in such a way as to really isolate the female plants. You could, if you had an indoor grow operation or a very sophisticated greenhouse with air filters to filter out pollen and artificial lights and irrigation, and if you're very skilled at what you're doing, you could get rid of all the male plants, clean the air so as to restrict any pollen from getting in, and only grow female plants. If you did this properly, you would have marijuana or cannabis plants that would grow and would never seed because none of the female plants would ever be pollinated. And you would have grown sinsemilla, which is a term you maybe have heard like in reggae songs or hip-hop songs, people referring to sinsemilla. It basically means cannabis grown female plants, that is, grown in the absence of male plants so that they produce no seeds, and consequently high levels of resin, because those female plants are just producing more and more resin, in a sense hoping to get pollinated but just never getting pollinated because there are no males in the environment. And the THC levels in sinsemilla can be quite high, maybe 10 to 15 or even higher percent, so a stronger grade of marijuana. If you wanted an even stronger product and even more compact, you could actually scrape the resin off the leaves of the plant. If you go back a couple slides, there's a picture of a person holding a kind of a tightly kind of clumped lump of marijuana that had been harvested from a cannabis plant, and you can see on his or her hand kind of a sticky brown substance. That's the resin, again, where most of the cannabinoids are. You could, if you had the time and were willing to, engage in the effort, scrape off those leaves, scraping off that resin and kind of packing it into a little wad. And if you did that, you'd have hashish. Hashish is just resin from cannabis plants, and depending on whether or not those plants were pollinated, and depending on how good a job the person did who was scraping off the leaves, you could have THC levels that vary quite a lot, from very little THC to very high levels of THC, upwards of 70% THC. So quite a potent a dose of at least one of the cannabinoids, THC. If you're even more interested in getting a still stronger product, you could dissolve your hashish in an oil and then filter it to remove some of the dust and other junk. And then you could, after having dissolved that stuff, you could sort of purify it out and filter it out to have an oil, and that would be hashish oil, which again can have THC levels that vary quite a bit, but clearly are sort of getting up to the very, very high level of concentration, so very strongly concentrated dose of this cannabinoid. And then just recently, in the last couple of years, I've been seeing people on YouTube post videos about how to make a new product, relatively new product, called butane hash oil, or BHO, or sometimes it's called dabs, or even earwax, for the obvious reason that it looks a bit like earwax, which is kind of gross. You would make BHO by taking butane, the lighter fluid that you use in a cigarette lighter if you smoke, and infusing that into a lump of marijuana. So if you bought marijuana, took all the stems away, any seeds away, and you had this sort of massive green stuff, you could pour butane oil over it. The butane oil acts as a solvent. It would dissolve out a lot of the resin, including all those cannabinoids that you like. You could then extract the plant product and then very carefully try to dry off the butane oil, leaving behind this sort of residue of fairly well filtered and fairly purified resin. The trick to doing this apparently is that, of course, as you're drying off the butane's highly volatile. You don't want it to catch fire. If it does, it could explode. And I've seen literally quite a few YouTube videos of people trying to dry off their soggy, butane-soaked, hash oil in an oven or on a grill, and of course lighting themselves on fire and exploding their kitchen. So not that I would recommend doing this anyway, but it's pretty dangerous to do. Again, if you're living in a part of the country where marijuana is legalized, I know in Colorado there are companies that under fairly good safety standards produce this stuff for sale, like BHO extracted cannabis. So pretty interesting, sort of a new trend, but the point is, you can see, like hash oil, it gets to a very high level of concentration of THC. Okay, so with all that in mind, you might be wondering to yourself, is marijuana getting more potent? That is, over the years, has it become more and more potent? For a while, it was a few years back, there was actually an advertising campaign that was being put out by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. That's a branch of that's an organization associated with the executive branch of the federal government, and their ad campaign was called "Not Your Father's Marijuana." It was the principle of this advertising campaign was that marijuana is a lot stronger than it used to be, and thus is more dangerous than it used to be. At the time when I first saw this, it kind of irritated me, to be honest, because it felt like it was a bit of a dodge. It was like saying, well, grown-ups, back when you were young and you smoked marijuana, it wasn't that big a deal because marijuana was pretty safe back then, but nowadays marijuana is a lot more dangerous. It seemed like a bit of a scare tactic. And it actually got me sort of interested in this question. Is it in fact true that marijuana is becoming stronger over the years? And the answer is actually quite interesting. There is a group that has been monitoring marijuana potency over the years and publishing data on it, publishing data on the potency in terms of the percent concentration of THC from marijuana that has been seized in law enforcement. And as you can see in the little margin at the bottom here, this is from the Potency Monitoring Project from the University of Mississippi, and they are charting levels of THC in seized marijuana over the last several decades. So again, the organization is the Cannabis Potency Monitoring Project out of the University of Mississippi. They're funded by the DEA, and what they do is they collect, or more commonly are sent, samples of marijuana and other products that have been seized by law enforcement, and they run them through pharmacological analysis. And I'm just in the next few slides going to highlight a little bit of information that I pulled down from their website. So you can see here, this is samples of kind of regular marijuana, kind of sort of normal stuff, if you will, regular marijuana. You can see different number in the top graph there. That's just the number of samples seized in a given year and sent for analysis. And in the bottom, you can see the level of THC reported and how it has changed over the years, from back in the 70s when the average level of THC was maybe less than 2% to more recent years where it's upwards of 5 or maybe even 6% THC. You can see also here the numbers of seizure of sinsemilla. This is kind of high-grade marijuana that's been carefully cultivated, and the amount of that that's been seized in recent years has gone up quite a bit. That's the top graph. And you can see the percentage concentration of THC in the bottom graph. That's also gone up quite a bit, from a low of maybe 4% in the 70s to a high of maybe, I don't know, 10 or 11 or 12% in the early 2000s. So with this in mind, is marijuana getting more potent? The answer is yeah, some of it is. I mean, the regular marijuana has increased somewhat in its potency over the years, and the high-end marijuana has increased a lot in its potency and is more available than it's ever been before. It's easier. You hear this anecdotally in talking to police. I've sort of heard similar stories from their end of things. It's easier to get higher grade marijuana now than it ever has been in the past, and that marijuana has been, or is, much stronger than it used to be. Of course, a question that is raised here is, are users getting more high or more stoned than they ever did before? That's actually pretty difficult to study. One, because marijuana, at least from a federal perspective, is still an illegal drug. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this semester, or I'm sorry, in this lecture. So it's difficult to get federally funded research on actual marijuana use. It's been noted that people who smoke more high-grade levels of marijuana, stronger marijuana with higher concentrations of THC, tend to smoke fewer puffs of smoke and tend to smoke less deeply than people who are smoking lower grades of marijuana, which reminds me a lot of the titration hypothesis that we saw with nicotine in cigarettes. You recall that when we look at cigarette smokers, if we give someone who's a cigarette smoker a relatively strong cigarette with a lot of nicotine in it, he or she will tend to just puff a few puffs so as to top up the level of nicotine that they need in their body. If you give that same person a cigarette with relatively little nicotine, he or she will puff a lot, to get and take deeper breaths so as to get more smoke and by extension get more nicotine. It's likely that a similar process happens with marijuana smokers. Again, anecdotally, I've heard this, and I've talking to people who work a lot with marijuana users. The idea of people smoking high-grade marijuana but smoking only a few puffs seems to make sense. Does that mean marijuana is safer than it used to be? Does that mean it's not as safe as it used to be? It's honestly, I think, hard to say. And I'm certainly not trying to mount an argument that marijuana is entirely safe. There are risks with it, as there are with all drugs. But I guess I am trying to argue that it's a little bit difficult to conclude simply that because marijuana is stronger than it used to be, it's necessarily the case that people are getting much more stoned than they used to, or much more high than they used to. All that being said, there's a very funny clip by the comedian Louis C.K. talking about smoking marijuana with young fans. I guess people are in their 20s, and smoking marijuana with them the way he used to smoke marijuana when he was in high school, and that is to say, taking really big, deep puffs and getting far, far, far more high and stoned than he really wanted to. I'll try and find that and link to it on Blackboard, so it's funny to check out. Another question that comes up when we talk about the potency of marijuana is, Are users nowadays more likely to get addicted or become dependent on marijuana than they used to be? And here the answer is probably difficult to say precisely. I would put it at a maybe. In general, we find that the risk of addiction or dependence increases with the potency of most drugs. So you're more likely to get addicted to alcohol if you drink potent alcohol. If you're drinking shots of whiskey or drinking large amounts of alcohol than if you're drinking relatively small amounts. You're more likely to get addicted to opiates if you inject them and get a sort of a strong, potent dose rather than if you just snort them, although not that that's entirely safe either. In general, there's this pattern we see where stronger, more potent drugs produce stronger, more potent effects within their users and can, for some people, pose a greater risk for addiction or dependence. People who smoke marijuana a lot, people who smoke it regularly, people who smoke high-grade marijuana with a lot of THC and other cannabinoids in it are more likely to suffer withdrawal symptoms when they stop using, which also tends to suggest that they're at greater risk for becoming addicted or dependent. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, way back when I saw this advertising campaign quite a few years ago, I was skeptical at first. But I did what I think most of us should do, which is I tried to, as best as I could, get information on the issue and think about it a bit. And I've come away from that with kind of a mixed impression. Is marijuana more potent than it used to be? Absolutely, especially if we're talking about high-grade marijuana. Are people getting more high than they used to? Maybe. Are people at greater risk for addiction? Perhaps, maybe even probably, at least if they're using strong marijuana and using it heavily. So kind of an interesting trend, at least in recent times, to think about. With that in mind, I actually want to take a big step back and talk more about the distant past and the history of marijuana. So in the next quite a few slides, I'll talk about what we know about the history of marijuana, and it's a long and I think very fascinating history. I'll just try and kind of hit the high points. Although marijuana grows pretty much all around the world, as best as we can tell, the history of its use by humans probably begins first in Asia. In past lectures, the lecture on tea, I believe, I talked about Shen Yun, who is this legendary figure from Chinese history / mythology. It sort of depends on where you read as to whether this person actually really existed or if he's a kind of a semi-mythical figure. Regardless of his, who he was exactly, he's credited as being the father of Chinese medicine. And if you're familiar with Chinese medicine, you know that a lot of it has to do with taking different herbs which have different supposed health effects. And within some of Shen Yun's writing, or at least writing that was credited to him, there are references to using the cannabis plant for treatment of a variety of different sorts of problems, including things like pain during menstruation, or pain during childbirth, or difficulty sleeping, or a variety of problems that sort of make sense to us today because they have to do, at least some of them, with pain management. I'll talk about that in my next lecture, actually. Around the same time, let's say, in history, we see evidence in India of religious use of this cannabis or marijuana from cannabis. There is within the Hindu pantheon, there's the god Shiva, who is, at least in some depictions, associated with using marijuana. Interestingly, some of this is in smoked form. Some of it is in a beverage called bang, which is made from cannabis. Cannabis, as we'll see later, is not, or I should say, marijuana, and even more precisely, the cannabinoids in marijuana are not particularly water soluble. So if you had a bunch of marijuana and wanted to make a beverage to drink rather than smoking it, it wouldn't do so well if you mixed it with water and brewed like a tea. But what you could do is you could mix it with milk or something that has a fairly high fat content. And if you did that, the cannabinoids dissolve rather easily into lipids and can then be consumed that way. And actually, nowadays, when people make and consume edible marijuana products, they're often making things like chocolates or caramels or butters, which are easy ways, because they're relatively fatty, to extract cannabinoids from marijuana. So there's some long history there as well. A little bit later in history, around the 5th century BC, there's evidence of people in what's now Iran, used to be called Scythia, at least at some points in history, doing recreational use of marijuana. They would, at least in some accounts, there's an account by the Greek historian Herodotus of the Scythians piling up large amounts of cannabis and lighting essentially like a big bonfire, and then erecting a tent over it, and then everyone would stand inside the tent and just kind of inhale the smoke and get high that way. So perhaps ceremonial, but probably also recreational use. Much later in history, around the 12th century AD, we have records of people selling hashish around the Middle East and North Africa, and the idea of hashish and the hashish trade becoming kind of a popular way of trading and making money during that time period. During the 11th and 12th centuries, crusaders from Europe returned, to their home, returned from the Middle East with tales of using cannabis or using marijuana. And people in Europe were using the cannabis plant to make rope and fabrics before that time. But the idea of using cannabis recreationally got a little bit of a boost in Europe, at least during the 11th and 12th century. And then much later, during the kind of the age of exploration, marijuana was important, or I should say cannabis was important as a source of rope and as a source of fabric for sails, and explorers brought hemp with them to the Americas when they were traveling. Now, hemp was already growing in the Americas, but it was a trade commodity. It was something that could be valuably grown and traded. It was also something that you needed a supply of if you were going to sail a ship across the Atlantic, and so people brought it with them, and kind of the use of cannabis and the trade in cannabis continued and expanded during those centuries. Much later in time, in the 19th and into the early 20th century, in Europe, there were wars in Europe, as there have been throughout Europe's history. During the 19th century, the French army invaded Egypt and brought back, or kind of repopularized, the idea of using hashish as an intoxicant. Napoleon's army, his soldiers, came into contact with people who used hashish recreationally, and many of the soldiers enjoyed the practice themselves and kind of brought it back with them to Europe when they returned from conquest. And it was during the 19th century that there was a number of sort of artistic and kind of cultural movements within Europe that kind of emphasized the use of marijuana as an intoxicant. So people who were self-styled romantics or bohemians, these were artists and writers who kind of rejected society's values and embraced more exotic ideas of culture and art. Many of them were sort of advocates of using hashish. There was a famous club of the hashish eaters in Paris at the time, where people would eat hashish confectionaries and then would develop poetry or make art of other sorts. It was kind of part of the culture of the time. It's worth noting that in the 19th and 20th centuries, and continuing today, in the Caribbean, there was a blending of African religions from slaves brought over from Africa and Christianity from people in the slave trade and people who were colonists. There's also cultural connections where Hindu servants and indentured servants were brought over who introduced cannabis smoking to people who were living in the Caribbean at that time. And it was that blending of African religion and Christian religion and Indian Hindu religion, including cannabis use, that kind of formed this mix, which we now understand as Rastafarianism. So if you ever listen to reggae music or even some hip-hop music and hear references to Rastafarianism and using marijuana, there actually is real history there, and it's a really fascinating history and disturbing in some senses history of slavery and cultural connections and kind of a mixing of cultures in a particular part of the world in the 19th and 20th century. So if we shift our focus over to America, and we're roughly in the time frame now, we're in the early 20th century. If you were living back then, you could find cannabis in a lot of different products, like all those patent medicines I've talked about already in previous lectures. So extracts of cannabis, or more accurately, extracts of marijuana, were present or were sold all over the place. So here are a couple examples. There's the fluid extract of cannabis indica that you can see on the right here. And on the left, a patent medicine called chlorodyne. This is probably after 1914 because it actually lists the ingredients on it. And you can see it includes morphine, cannabis, nitroglycerin, and some other stuff, including peppermint oil. So a kind of a minty beverage that would probably knock you very far off your feet if you were to have some. You could probably buy it legally from the from this pharmaceutical company way back in the day. So cannabis, like cocaine, or I should say marijuana, like cocaine, like morphine, was kind of present in a lot of patent medicines that were bought and used by people to manage pain or to supposedly treat a variety of different illnesses. Slightly later in history, in the 1920s, we encounter Prohibition. Of course, we've talked about Prohibition already. During Prohibition in the 20s in America, alcohol was mostly illegal for almost all people to use, but marijuana wasn't. So marijuana experienced kind of a boost in popularity during the Prohibition years, as at least some people shifted from using from using alcohol to using marijuana. It's also worth noting that America's great musical traditions, which include among them jazz and blues, have a long history of songs that have to do with marijuana. So there is a whole sort of genre of jazz music called reefer songs, which are songs, kind of up-tempo, snappy jazz songs that you would listen to if you were smoking marijuana and feeling kind of that more high feeling, that kind of giggly, happy feeling. Blues music has ample references to marijuana. It's kind of funny to reflect upon this, I suppose, because I think nowadays if you think of music and drugs, you maybe imagine rap music or other modern music forms which reference drugs, and maybe that seems like a very new thing, but really it wasn't. Again, way back into the 20s and probably even earlier, there are plenty of examples of people making and performing and enjoying music while under the influence of marijuana. So maybe you're thinking to yourself, okay, marijuana has been around for a long time. In America, it was well into the 20s or so, and it was still legal and apparently popular, at least among large segments of the population. So why is it that marijuana became illegal? I mean, I'm old enough that when I grew up, marijuana was pretty much illegal everywhere. It's only been relatively recently that kind of attitudes and to some extent state laws have been changing such that marijuana has been decriminalized in some regions and made legal entirely in other regions. So for most of my life, marijuana has been this really illegal drug, along with all the other bad illegal drugs. When did that happen? And maybe more importantly, why did that happen? Well, the story's complicated, but it has to do a little bit with fears that people have about drugs. And this is kind of a common theme that we've encountered before. If there are times in history when the popularity of a drug increases, there's usually a bit of a lag, and then there's, after that time, kind of a rise in concern and even fear about the possible negative consequences of use of such a drug. And that's true for cocaine, it was true for the opiates, it's true for marijuana as well. So during the 1930s, there were a series of very lurid newspaper articles about people who killed others, including family members, while under the influence, supposedly, of marijuana. You can see here on the left a reprint from, quote, "The Most Heinous of Crimes" in 1933, Victor Licata of Tampa, Florida, not too far from where I went to grad school. On October 17th, 1933, while under the influence of marijuana, murdered his mother, father, sister, and 2 brothers, in capital letters, with an axe while they were asleep. That was probably the most famous of these news stories from the time, although there were others. Although it's worth pointing out that, like stories about cocaine-related crimes and like stories about opiate-related crimes, many of these were exaggerated accounts that probably weren't entirely based in reality and rather were designed to exploit and to stoke the fears of people who were already kind of worried about marijuana. This fellow here, Licata, in retrospect, if we look at some of the records on him, probably was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He may or may not have been using marijuana. If he was, it certainly didn't help him, and the crime he committed was horrible, of course. But it's not entirely at all clear that it's the marijuana which suddenly drove him into this crazed homicidal rage. But the point is, there were fears kind of in the public, kind of percolating at that time about the possible downsides of marijuana, and there were kind of famous lurid newspaper articles that capitalized on that fear. During that time period, there's also a lot of immigration, as there was throughout all of the 20th century and before. and since to the United States, including a lot of immigration from Mexico following the Mexican Revolution. So especially in the south and southwest of the country, there were large numbers of Mexican immigrants who came to the country to work at jobs, especially in agriculture, and many of these immigrants grew and used marijuana. Now, to be clear, they weren't the only people in society who were using marijuana. Plenty of other folks were too, especially if you consider folks who were using marijuana in extracted form in various patent medicines and other medicinal cure-alls. But because of racism around the time, the Mexican people, especially poor Mexican people, were kind of linked to marijuana, and so fears and animosity directed towards those folks were also directed towards the drug marijuana. Of course, this all got a lot worse during the 1930s, in the height of the Great Depression, when there was an enormous amount of fear and anger directed towards poor people, and especially poor immigrants, for taking the jobs of other folks. So again, as we often see during periods of economic downturn, there is anger and frustration and frank hatred directed towards people who are perceived as taking jobs away from quote-unquote real Americans, and Mexican folks then suffered greatly for that, as unfortunately they have to this day. If you take some of the recent speeches by some of our political candidates seriously. The point of this is that, at least in my judgment, and I'm not alone in this impression, racism plays a role in our attitudes about drugs. It has historically, and it probably still does today. In the case of marijuana, there's ample evidence that racism against African Americans who are associated with marijuana through their culture and through jazz music and through the blues, and racism against Mexicans and other Central and South American immigrants who were sort of thought to be using marijuana and thought to be kind of criminal and dangerous anyway. That racism kind of heightened the fear around the drug that those people were allegedly supposed to be using. Never mind the fact that many other people were also using that drug. At the same time that the fears were being kind of stoked around marijuana, because of racism, there's also this kind of association with crime and sex and kind of the kind of exciting, dangerous life that grew up around the drug as well. And this is actually fairly similar to what we saw with cocaine. When cocaine was made illegal, at least at a federal level in the 1920s, it became hard to use, it became hard to find, it became hard to use, but there was also kind of an additional attraction associated with it because it was a forbidden fruit, if you will. A very similar thing happened with marijuana in the 30s. It was made illegal and it was harder for many folks to get, but it also had this additional attraction of being a risky, dangerous drug, even though, as we'll see, the risks and dangers associated with marijuana are maybe not quite so severe as has been alleged in the past. On the right here you can see Marijuana, Weed with Roots in Hell, a very famous exploitation film, along with Reefer Madness, a number of others that came out about this time, that sought to kind of capitalize on people's fears associated with this drug. So as you can see here, it's a daring drug expose. It's not recommended for children that you watch this. Marijuana, Weed with Roots in Hell, featuring, among other things, lust, crime, sorrow, hate, shame and despair, misery, weird orgies, wild parties, and unleashed passions. Now, I think it's clear to anyone who's at all sensible about this that the makers of these movies were not so much interested in giving people sober advice about what drugs they should or shouldn't use, but were rather interested in selling tickets to a movie that promised a kind of a sexiness and a thrill that at least some people are kind of interested in. Way back at the beginning of this portion of my lecture, you probably noticed, or I hope you noticed, I had a cover of a dime store novel called Marijuana Girl, which was came out a little bit later in history. I think that was from the 40s, although I don't have my notes in front of me right now. Again, trying to capitalize on this association between a drug, marijuana, and kind of sex and crime and kind of a dark, dangerous life. Interesting to see. Anyway, so that's kind of the picture in the 1920s, a little bit in the 1930s as well. There's kind of racism. There's a sense that marijuana is just generally maybe a very dangerous drug that could be contributing to crime. Another important factor in the illegalization of marijuana was what happened to a government agency after the end of Prohibition. And that agency was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which actually grew out of the Federal Bureau of Prohibition and took over responsibility for controlling a variety of different drugs in the 20s and into the 30s, especially after Prohibition ended. Under the aegis of the Harrison Tax Act and another law, which I don't think I've mentioned before, the Narcotics Drug Import and Export Act of 1922, the FBN was kind of tasked with policing at a federal level drugs. And here, their focus was on opiates and cocaine, which at that point in history were seen as relatively dangerous drugs. The pendulum had swung already on those two drugs. Harry Anslinger was the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and was really responsible for expanding the focus of the agency to include marijuana. And it's interesting, if you're reading historical accounts of Anslinger, the sense that I get from the historians who've covered this time period is that Anslinger really didn't have an axe to grind against marijuana per se, but he saw that by including marijuana as a drug that needed to be policed, he was able to expand the budget for his agency and expand the power that his agency had. So really it was a somewhat cynical move, I suppose you might say, to gain more power, gain more money by adding to the list of dangerous drugs this relatively innocuous drug, marijuana, which most people at the time weren't entirely all that concerned about. Sure, there had been some scary newspaper articles about it. Yes, some people associated it with members of society, members of different ethnic or cultural groups who were thought to be dangerous. But by and large, America wasn't all that worried about marijuana until it was added to the list of dangerous drugs under the control of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. It's also interesting to note that Anslinger was the person who's credited with developing the gateway hypothesis, the idea that even if marijuana itself isn't particularly dangerous, it might nonetheless lead you to use other dangerous drugs. If you begin using marijuana, it might not hurt you, but it might encourage you to then go on and use heroin or use cocaine, and that stuff will hurt you. So goes the theory. So anyway, during this time period, and here we're talking about the 30s and into the 40s, greater government scrutiny and greater government control was exercised over marijuana. It became lumped in with other drugs like cocaine, like the various opiates, and thought of by association as this rather dangerous drug to use. By the before the 1960s, it was getting towards the tail end of the 20th century, marijuana was associated with use by minorities and folks of lower social class. Now, again, there were plenty of people of all classes of society and all ethnic groups who were using marijuana, but the dominant associations in the culture was that marijuana was something that was used by minorities, by poorer people, and maybe even by more dangerous or criminal people. That changed during and after the 1960s. In many ways, the 1960s was just this flowering period for interest in all drugs, including opiates and cocaine and hallucinogens. But among those was marijuana, and there was more widespread use of marijuana during that time period, especially use by people who were white or middle or upper middle class. So folks from walks of life and segments of society who weren't really supposed to be using drugs began to use drugs, or at least began to talk about using drugs. And there was that shift in our focus, and from then on, really, marijuana's popularity surged back. During the 1970s, marijuana was put on Schedule 1 as part of the Comprehensive Drug Control Act, and if you watched the historical video clip that I linked to on Blackboard when I put up my lectures about hallucinogens, you'll recall that most historians who look at this move really argue that it was a ploy to be able to criminalize people who were in the who were in the counterculture, who were protesting against the Vietnam War, who were protesting against the government, people who were on the political left. Of course, in this country, it's difficult to make illegal free speech. That's a good thing. If you want to protest the government, if you want to protest the war, that's your right. But if you use a drug which the government says is illegal, it creates a good pretext for arresting you. So marijuana, like LSD and the hallucinogens, which by many ways of reckoning aren't particularly dangerous, were put on Schedule 1, the most illegal level of the Comprehensive Drug Control Act, largely, at least some historians have argued, and I tend to believe, because it created a way to arrest people. It created a way to criminalize people's behavior. Now, since that time, marijuana, and even to today, marijuana remains an illegal drug from the federal perspective, although in recent years the Obama administration has been talking like they're going to stop exercising as much federal control over marijuana, especially for small amounts. Most of the action in terms of marijuana laws now exists at state and local levels, as different parts of the country try and figure out how they want to respond to the use of marijuana. It's a weird situation. We have a federal government which says that this drug is basically highly illegal, but we have cities and states within the country which are experimenting, to use that word loosely, with creating different classes of use for the drug. We're wrestling with some interesting questions right now. Should marijuana be illegal? And if it is illegal, what type of offense should it be? Should it be a criminal offense where you could be arrested? Or could it be maybe a civil offense where you're issued a citation and perhaps have to pay a fee, like a traffic ticket? We're asking the question, who should enforce the laws around marijuana? Should it be something that the federal government is principally concerned with, or should it be state governments or local governments? We're also facing again, as we always have, I suppose, the question of, is marijuana dangerous, or how dangerous is it? Please don't take this lecture to be me kind of soapboxing for the safety and the benefits of marijuana. I'm not someone who's particularly interested in marijuana personally, and I'm not trying to argue that we should make it legal and everyone should use it, but I do think as a society we need to face this question of how dangerous is this drug. We can think about it in terms of its toxicity. We can also think about it in terms of its risk for addiction. And we can face that interesting question posed way back in the day by Anslinger is marijuana a gateway to using other drugs? So those are, I hope, some provocative questions that are maybe getting you thinking. I'll try and answer some of them, or at least address some of them, in my next lecture. I'll kind of continue to talk about marijuana and talk about some other aspects of the drug, including what we know about current rates of use, what we know about its pharmacology, and what we know about its acute and chronic effects within the body. But for the time being, I want to stop. It's been almost an hour. That's a long lecture for me to deliver, and I'm sure a long one for you to sit through. So thank you, as I always say, for your attention. If you have a chance, maybe step away from the computer, grab yourself a snack or a cup of something caffeinated and nice, relax for a few minutes, let this information sink in, and then when you're ready, come back, because I'll probably have my next lecture available for you. So again, thanks so much. I'll see you soon.